Thank you. So the topic today is REDD+, and REDD+ is an acronym that means a number of different things to different people. But in essence, a vision for channeling money from donor countries or from the global community, really, that are reliant on the natural carbon capture and storage mechanisms of forests into the developing countries that have these forest assets. So a very simple concept, but for those of you that work in the area, you'll know that it's rather difficult to put into practice and difficult to turn into really a workable mechanism to address climate change. But we do know that the prize there is potentially very big. We know that perhaps over a third of the carbon mitigation that we need each year to meet the 2°C challenge could come from reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation and from restoring forests. So, as she said, myself and colleagues from the Climate Development Knowledge Network undertook a series of interviews with stakeholders in the REDD+ space to understand where they felt REDD+ was going at the moment. So the first group of stakeholders that we spoke to were countries trying to access finance from REDD+. And it was very clear that in their view, REDD+ has remained much of a kind of elusive promise. Since it was first raised at the UNFCCC back in 2005, we estimate that it's only raised about perhaps just under $3 billion under the REDD+ banner. And most of that has gone into capacity building. So rather than results-based payments, which could actually be used to incentivize actors on the ground. So it's been a much slower process than first envisaged. And the process to actually sign agreements for results-based payments has been very slow and very frustrating. So we heard a lot of this, and it's not really surprising that we had a lot of frustration. These days, there are a multitude of different frameworks and expectations for countries looking to get results-based payments. So there's everything from the Green Climate Fund's new scorecard for their results-based payments pilot. There's the methodological framework you have for the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility that's run by the World Bank. And you've got frameworks that the private sector uses, like the Verified Carbon Standard. And all of these actually go beyond what's set out in the Warsaw Framework that was first agreed for REDD+ in 2013, but they're all slightly different. So it's a complete minefield, and one that also leaves the field very open to different levels of robustness. And that's something that we also then heard from a second group of stakeholders, typically the NGOs, who are very concerned about the robustness of REDD+. As we know, there's a lot of concerns about how the rights of local communities and indigenous peoples are respected in the course of REDD+, and also concerns about whether REDD+ can really deliver real emissions reductions rather than hot air due to processes like leakage and the permanence of forests. I suppose the good news is that over the last 10 years, the dedicated community that has been working on REDD+ has done a lot to address some of these issues. There are now very strict safeguards in place in many instances. There have been extensive discussions over the methods for calculating emissions reductions and methods for things to counter things like the permanence of forests. But REDD+ really remains kind of quite haunted by many of these issues. And this is definitely what we heard from our kind of third group of stakeholders, which were perhaps those actors slightly more at a distance from REDD+. And all too often we heard the phrase, isn't REDD+ dead? Many of these actors, some of them still work in land use, but have perhaps turned away from concentrating on REDD+ to other issues at the forefront of discussions today, like how you can use market-based approaches to remove deforestation from agricultural supply chains. And clearly that is key. And indeed something that REDD+ can support. But for this community of stakeholders, I guess REDD+ still holds a real aura of complexity, and they're yet to see REDD+ kind of deliver results at scale on the ground. So it's very clear from the interviews that we conducted as part of this research that somewhere along the line, REDD+ has lost the confidence of some of its key stakeholders. This is clearly a big issue. We really need the incentives around cutting down forests to be reversed. I don't need to tell you that here today. And we also know that there could be some really key opportunities on the horizon for REDD+, to start driving more finance into it. Perhaps most notably, the potential to include REDD+ as an offsetting mechanism, or eligible kind of offset, within ICAO's sort of aviation offsetting mechanism. But if the stakeholders that we spoke to as in the course of this process don't even trust REDD+ 100%, how can we stand a chance with the stakeholders that are new to this topic? And hopefully we'll start investing in it. So we wanted to try and address this topic with our research and put forward some recommendations. And perhaps naturally, as an audit firm, being PwC, we turned to the financial sector for inspiration. In the financial sector for financial accounting, the international community has converged on a series of principles that help to maintain confidence in in mainstream financial markets. And we wanted to see how those same principles could be applied to REDD+. So we've done this analysis, and you can read about it in our report, but I'll share with you the kind of 3 headline recommendations from it. So the first is that we need to see REDD+ reporting becoming more accessible. So in the financial world, one of the key principles is that the financial statements you produce have to be relevant to the end decision maker. And in REDD+, for those of you who are in the space, you'll know that the program documentation around REDD+ programs often numbers in excess of 400 pages long, and is totally inaccessible to anyone who sits outside of that world or outside of the donor world looking at these programs. So we need to really up our game on communication. The second key finding was that we need to harmonize REDD+ approaches. In the financial world, it's really key that you have some form of comparability between the performance of different companies so that you can look at their statements side by side and put their results in context. For REDD+, as I've said, there are a number of different frameworks that different people are using. And there are some really fundamental differences then in how these programs are constructed. Notably, for example, how you calculate your initial baseline against which you then measure your emissions reductions. So for stakeholders that don't spend their whole lives thinking about REDD+, and frankly, even those who do, reading all these different program documents can be very confusing and quite misleading because that comparability just isn't there. So the third and final point links to that. If we're working towards a harmonized or more harmonized approach on REDD+, we also need to see the robustness of REDD+ increasing to a kind of common level. So in the financial world, clearly, an investor looks to the financial statements and expects them to be a faithful representation of reality. In the REDD+ world, we too need to see a pathway to a kind of common and robust approach on key topics. Things like, how do you measure the uncertainties of the data, or what's expected in terms of third-party verification? And until there's a common standard across, it's going to be very difficult for external stakeholders to engage and know that REDD+ is robust. So clearly, this sets out a long-term vision of where REDD+ needs to get to make sure it retains and rebuilds confidence with its key stakeholders. We realize that this is not going to happen overnight, but one of the aspects we also drew out in our report that we think is a really key interim measure is making sure that we drive for transparency on the methods being used in REDD+, perhaps in the form of kind of a ratings agency for REDD+ programs and projects. So all of these recommendations, including that last one, are something that we are now following up with a number of stakeholders in the REDD+ space. I'd be really keen to have any reflections you have on the report and our findings, and if you want to join us on the journey of rebuilding trust in REDD+. Thank you.